Ladies and gentlemen, as the war in Ukraine continues to reshape the geopolitical landscape, the world watches with deep concern and persistent questions. What does the future hold for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the international order? How might military developments, diplomatic negotiations, and global alliances influence the trajectory and eventually the resolution of this conflict? Today, we bring together three distinguished experts. His Excellency, Mr. Hryhoriy Nemyria, First Deputy Chairman of the Ukrainian Parliament. Welcome.
Thank you.
And two other experts are joining online. Ms. Aino Rosa Kristina Spohr, Professor of International History at LSE University, and also General Sir Nick Carter, UK's former Chief of Defence Staff. Today's goal is not just to understand the current dynamics, but to explore where they may lead and what choices lie ahead for the international community. Your Excellency, I would like to begin with you. 3 years since the Russian invasion, the US government appears to be negotiating a conditional end to the war with Putin. First, what stage have the discussions reached? And secondly, what terms are you and the government willing to accept?
Thank you, and I'm very glad to be here, partially because I have some Greek roots. My maternal grandmother, she's from Ponte Greeks. So I was born in Donetsk, and there is Azov Sea, the Black Sea, where the sizable Greek community, 120,000 Greeks, were living before the war. And Mariupol was the epicenter of the Greek life before the war. I'm glad to be here, and thank you for the invitation. And I cannot resist, but because even at war, there is space for some even politically motivated humor. We're talking about war in Ukraine, and the only one who is physically present on the stage is Ukrainian. The Brits and the Europeans and the Americans are online at the distance, observing, and the rest of the world is watching. So it's politically motivated humor, and it's because of strike we know that our American, European, and British friends were not able to join. But answering your question, there are two ways to go. To continue as it was and as it is now, for more than 3 years already, more of the same, or to start to change the trajectory. So we are now at the moment where is a window, whatever this window, broad or narrow, I would say rather narrow window opportunity, to change the trajectory of this war. And it's not just about talks, it's not yet negotiations. There are talks about ceasefire. And not even about a full ceasefire, but partial ceasefire. And we know how the long way could be from the partial, full ceasefire, truce, armistice, peace negotiations, and peace. So we are at the very early stage of this road ahead. But this is the road ahead. And in this way, I think we Ukrainians, after 3 years of war, believe that the sooner this war ends, the better for Ukraine, the better for Europe, better for the United States, and better for the whole world. Protracted war, only Putin benefits from protracted war. And I believe that the deeper you think about this, he looks like more afraid of peace than of war, as it is now.
Your Excellency, recently President Trump called President Zelensky a dictator and continued by saying that he has done a terrible job. In your opinion, why is there a tension between the two presidents, and as we have recently seen in the Oval Office?
I would be the last person willing to comment on this personal exchange of, or the style matters. So I would like rather concentrate on the substance. And the substance is very clear for us Ukrainians, for me as a politician. You know, when in 2014, Russia invaded eastern Ukraine and annexed Crimea, few believed that it was just a curtain raiser to a full-blown, large-scale invasion that came in 2022, in February. You know, before the war, Iran was something very distant to Ukrainians. North Korea was far away. Belarus was closer, but whatever would happen in Belarus stayed in Belarus. That was opinion. But already in the second year, if not the first year of the war, the Iranian missiles and drones were used by the Russians to strike and to kill Ukrainians. The North Korean troops are on the immediate border with Ukraine. They are in Europe. North Korean soldiers in Europe. And their missiles also targeted, and Russia, in proportional, now using more North Korea-produced missiles than before. Or take Belarus. I would like to remind you, the Russian tanks entered from the north via Belarus. They didn't cross Russian-Ukraine, they did cross Belarusian-Ukrainian border. So that shows how quickly things could change. And I guess substantively, last year I was here, and one of the Greek participants said a very important message, and I believe I would like to repeat it. He said, war is next door, and if we will do what we have to do, the war will come to us. I think this message still resonates. And in this sense, it's not just this war about Ukraine. It's about the European Union, or Europe as such. It's about the United States. It's about the most important thing, about the future of the international security order.
I see. Now, this, and realistically speaking, how does Ukraine defining victory, or at least a rational solution, meaning territorial crediting EU or NATO membership, or something broader?
Look, this war is not about the territory, or to be more precise, is not just about the territory. And if this war is not about the territory, then any peace deal, as President Trump calls it, peace deal, based on the principle land for peace, or peace for land, will not bring sustainable peace. It will be just a pause before the next round of war will come, even more horrible than this. If this war is not about the territory, that what is at stake in this war? And I believe what is at stake, and would like to repeat it again, is the future of the international or world security order. Just one example. Do we believe, or do we want, that the non-proliferation would stay as a part of the future security order? Do we believe this is good, or it will not stay? The outcome of the war will define what would be the case, because Ukraine, would like to remind again and again, gave up in 1994 third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, larger than the Chinese, British and the French together. Almost 2,000 strategic missiles, warheads, 176 ICBMs, 44 strategic bombers. Some of them are now used from the Caspian Sea to launch cruise missiles to Ukraine, and 2,500 tactical nukes in exchange of the security guarantees joining the non-proliferation regime. So when, after that, Ukraine has been attacked by one of the guarantors, and the rest of the guarantors were delivering lessons needed to prevent it. So what the lessons would be, you're talking not about the North Koreans, they already have it, or others, what the others, aspiring nations, would read from this outcome as the precedent. This is what at stake. And therefore, when you're asking about what the solution or kind of the contours of the peace, there are red lines that would define whether it would be a fair peace or it will be just a tactical peace to satisfy the demand of the momentum. The first red line, territorial integrity. So this is very important. Nobody should be allowed to change the borders by force. And that's why Russians do not like when the Chinese are always saying that they are in favor of the territorial integrity, for whatever reason. But this is very important, first red line that should not be. And by the way, this is fully in tradition of the American foreign policy. 1932 Stimson Decree didn't recognize the occupation of Manchuria by Japan. 1940 Welles Declaration on non-recognition of the occupation of Baltic states. 2018 Pompeo Declaration at the time of the first administration of President Trump, non-recognition of the illegal annexation of Crimea. So this is fully in line with the American tradition. The second red line, no cap for the development of Ukrainian armed forces, the most battle-hardened army in the world probably, or in Europe definitely now, is Ukrainian army, and no limits to its development as the force able to defend Ukraine. And third, very important, no veto for our European integration. And of course, needless to say, no intervention in how Ukraine will define and treat and explain its culture, its history, the other policies, the humanitarian domain. So those are red lines that are very important to have in mind, whoever would mediate, participate in the negotiations, and then perceiving the outcome of these negotiations.
I see. Moving to Professor Spohr. Professor Spohr, welcome. We are watching you online. Thank you so much for joining. I would like to begin the conversation with you by asking, in the book Exiting the Cold War, Entering a New World, you argue that the post-Cold War period shaped a new international order. Has Putin's war on Ukraine marked the definitive end of that order?
Well, thank you very much for having me online. I was online last night, so this is as close to Delphi as I could get due to the strike. And before I start, a quick response to what the Ukrainian colleague said in terms of, me and my other colleague being here in UK at a distance. For me, the war actually is very close because I'm half Finnish, and my grandfather, who was born in 1911, fought in the Winter War, Continuation War, and Lapland War for the independence of Finland. And he kept telling this to the conscripts until he died at the age of 105. So war has been very much part of my family history. And so I might look at it from a distance, from an aisle, but it is very much in mind. So as to your question on the world order and whether Putin's war against Ukraine has ended that, well, actually, in my monograph, which is called Post-War, Post-Square, I highlight that the international order that emerged from the Cold War was a dual act from the Cold War, because for a long time we didn't pay attention to China's exit from the Cold War. Namely, that you could have economic liberalization going hand in hand with authoritarianism, and that Deng Xiaoping's thought that if the socialist model would prove itself, the Chinese socialist model would prove itself superior to anything else, and if it took a long time, it wouldn't matter as long as it would prove itself superior. And of course, this whole notion of China as a world-leading power is something that Xi Jinping has been pointing to, and whether you work from within the international governance systems and whether you work within international law and whether you work within certain norms, supposedly, that does mean that you haven't got territorial or other kinds of ambition, for example, through money and placing other countries into a debt trap. So this One Belt, One Road initiative, one can look also in terms of skepticism when it comes to pressing for a post-West world order, which actually the Chinese and the Russians are both, and have both proclaimed since 2019, when Putin and Lavrov talked about that post-West world order and the liberal order being obsolete. But I like to stick more with this word, the international legal order. And that brings me to post-war world. When the Soviet Union collapsed and we had that so-called unipolar moment, let me come back to that term end of history that Fukuyama played with, this idea that with economic liberalization, political liberalization would always go hand in hand, and that it would be democracy as the highest form of human governance. Well, that obviously has proven wrong, because we have this fragmentation and disruption, and it's really, in that sense, ideological between democracy and pluralism versus authoritarianism in a system where we have global trade. And that, of course, is disrupted as well now through the US government.
You spoke about...
But the post-Ball order also goes back to 1945 and 1975, the UN Charter. Sorry, you were saying something?
Yeah, you spoke about fragmentation. Why does Europe seem so fragmented in the face of the Ukrainian crisis?
I think we have to understand that the Europe today, the Europe that came out of that, say, reunification in that post-war world, of course, different parts of Europe come with different historical baggage. If you compare Portugal with Estonia, the experience of Europe is completely different. In fact, we could take the view that the countries that border Russia take a completely different view on security. If you compare Finland, Estonia, Poland, Lithuania, if you look at those kinds of countries, they have focused on strong defense all along, whereas, for example, Germany, although it got unification, it played with interdependence, with being a civilian power, with trying to do Ost and West politics. And of course, when we think of whether that country can then take responsibility, defend our norms and principles and way of life, our freedom, they can see that Germany for 30 years drove that down. And that's why there has been the speech of the Zeitenwende, because it has had a completely different outlook. And of course, the Hungarians are doing something completely different. And the French, who focus on strategic autonomy and see their own position as a nuclear power, take a different position. And Britain, ever since the Brexit, is even outside that EU. So very difficult to bring everybody together, because it also has to do with your geography and your past. But with the northern enlargement and the eastern enlargement, both in EU and NATO, but also the most recent, the freedom of choice of Finland and Sweden of joining NATO, if you think of that also within the EU, then you have a new kind of formation of trees that are really pressing that element of defense and deterrence, not in conventional or in any other kinds of security terms, but also in terms of resilience and our political culture that we want to hold on to.
I see. The recent white paper on the future of the European defense stresses that, quote, the time has come for a renewed political ambition to act and turn the EU into a genuine security provider. What about the fact that the EU has aligned itself with the US defense doctrine? How feasible is to claim our independence from the United States?
I think we have to be a bit careful here, because we do not really want to see duplication of two organizations. And for all of Trump's isolationism, and I really mean the Trump administration, I don't mean necessarily the widest sections even of the US bureaucracy or the Pentagon, for example. There's all sorts of other people who still hold on to kinship and trust and reliability. And we see this over this debate of Sakur or the question of should American troops be withdrawn on. I think it's very important to consider two questions. One is your tactical response to the current war of conquest that Russia is conducting in Europe. Can we get to a ceasefire and really a fair of peace at some point where Russia has to learn a lesson? We cannot Russia win, because if Russia feels it wins with whatever, small, it can always go for more, and everybody else knows that. But I think it's important that the EU also as an organization focuses more on conventional side of things and also on its own nuclear capabilities, which puts France, of course, into a particular position. But we have seen that under Keir Starmer, we have seen also rapprochement with the UK again, and also the Germans in their coalition agreement yesterday. And we can read that Germany is really pressing for a friendship treaty. And I think it's very important also sort of see that Germany is the third or fourth largest economy in the world, is really now trying to reposition itself also within the EU context, but also in the NATO context, as a stronger actor longer term of how do we deter the Russia that cannot deal with its post-colonial trauma, frankly, the collapse of the Soviet Union meant.
Yeah. Speaking about NATO, a more provocative question. Do you foresee the end of the transatlantic alliance, namely NATO, or are we experiencing a temporary crisis under President Trump?
You're asking a historian, and I'm not really into futurology. I do believe that there's something very particular to this administration. The question actually inside the US is whether Trump manages with policies, whether it's crazy tariffs and inside trading perhaps, or whatever all this is about, because clearly it's not strategic, but whether in the 4 years he manages actually destroy the constitutionality and the democracy in the United States, and that will have repercussion. If he doesn't, then I do think that NATO is something where America was an empire invitation to Europe in the context of the Cold War. The Europeans want the Americans in, and it was about joining and doing something together. And there's something about a special kinship also. And of course, America was the hallmark in terms of also its constitution of democracy. So I don't want to declare the end because of this particular president, but I do expect that parts of the American population will also have to reconsider whether they want to drift towards, fascism, or whether they actually want to uphold rule of law in their own country, which then has actually implications for our Euro-Atlantic community. But therefore, I think it's very important for Europe now be steadfast and stress why freedom, democracy, pluralism, international legal and other kinds of structures, multilateralism really matter to us. And that's why as Europeans, we have to try and be cohesive, because we live on the same continent with, as I said, that Russia that cannot deal with its post-colonial trauma and is unwilling to recognize that it is revanchist and revisionist.
I see. General Sir Carter, I would like to call your military expertise. Do you see any shifts in Russia's military tactics in the Ukrainian war, specifically in Kursk, for example?
Sorry, I missed the key word you said. Do I see what in Russia's military tactics?
A shift, a strategic shift in Russia's military. So, because we are seeing a lot of maneuvers in Kursk, for example.
No, I don't think so. I think what's happened over the course of the last 3 years is that Russia has evolved a modus operandi for this particular battlefield, which maximizes Russia's strength in relation to Ukraine, namely scale and mass, but also the ability to integrate drones with electronic warfare, with massed artillery, and of course, waves and waves of human beings. And that sort of war of attrition works for their strengths. And that, of course, is what they've done, not just on the battlefield in eastern Ukraine, but also in trying to push Ukraine out of the Kursk salient. So I think, I wouldn't say I've seen a shift in it. I think what we've seen is them doubling down on what they can do. I mean, they do have a significant problem when it comes to low-level leadership. They don't have a sort of non-commissioned officer cadre like so many of our NATO allies do. And therefore, they have to find a way of just throwing human beings into the fight. And it's interesting when you consider that they've lost probably 30,000 casualties every month for the last 8 or 9 months, how they're able to sustain this. And you would have thought that at some stage the Russian population is going to notice, and it's going to become difficult for Mr. Putin to continue to do this. But it hasn't happened yet. So I'm afraid I think we're going to see more Russian tactics like this, and the cost to Ukraine is, of course, going to continue to be very deleterious.
I see. We saw that the Russian military is using Chinese soldiers, or at least we read the reports about the Chinese soldiers. Why they are using foreigners to fight in their war?
Well, again, I think the observation needs to be made that this war is becoming more globalized every day. I mean, we see North Korean soldiers on the battlefield, particularly the Kursk salient. Numbers vary, but I think we're probably talking about 15,000. I think we also have South Korean advisors, perhaps, with the Ukrainian government there in case North Koreans get captured and need interrogation and the like. We see Iran supplying missiles and drones to Russia. We see a campaign by the GRU in Europe of disinformation, sabotage, and all of that. The chief executive of Rheinmetall was the subject of an assassination attempt last year. And of course, we see cakes being cut in the Baltic, and I could go on. But we also see the war being globalized in Africa. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that somebody is paying Tuareg rebels in Mali to have a go at what is now called the Africa Corps, but was formerly the Wagner Group. So this war is becoming globalized. So when one homes in on who's actually fighting on the battlefield, be in no doubt that some Brits, some Americans, and other Europeans have fought for Ukraine as individuals. They haven't been sent there by their countries. And I suspect what we're seeing here with Chinese citizens is that they've chosen to come and fight as private individuals on this battlefield. I don't think we have any evidence yet that this is China getting more involved in the war, or indeed breaking China's technical neutrality in this war. So I think one has to be careful to establish the facts before we make gratuitous accusations. So my instinct at the moment is it's more likely to be individuals who've chosen to go there rather than anything more than that.
I see. Speaking on the long-term implications of the war in Ukraine, I don't want to be pessimistic, but we see Europe so unprepared for a multi-front war. In your view, how can we reverse that atmosphere and rapidly enhance our defense capabilities?
Well, the answer is it's not going to be possible to do it rapidly. I mean, for the next 5 years, whether we like it or not as Europeans, we are going to be dependent upon a whole load of American capabilities that European countries don't have. And the list is long, whether I'm talking about nuclear deterrence, offensive cyber, electronic warfare, space-based capabilities for command and control, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, air and ballistic missile defense, suppression of enemy air defenses, theatre level C and airlift for logistics, short and long-range files. I could go on. The list is long. And it is going to be extremely difficult for Europe to be able to reach those capabilities if the Americans choose to pull them out of NATO. And to the professor's point, we don't have adequate European cohesion when it comes to our defence industries. There's far too much national parochialism. And if we're going to try and do some burden sharing, my goodness, it's going to be quite a negotiation. It's going to make the negotiation over tariffs look like a child's game, because that has been the case for years. And I've seen it throughout my 45 years' worth of military service. When you look at interoperability in Europe, we've got 29 different classes of warship. We've got 20-odd different type tanks, 17 different artillery systems. Again, the list could go on. So don't use the word rapidly. However keen people are to solve this problem, it's going to take longer, I would have thought, than the next 2 to 3 years. It's going to take 5 to 10 years to fix it. And that is if the money is actually translated into action. I have seen no evidence yet of any of the fine political words about money actually seeing it being spent with the defence sector and the defence industry, which is why smarter ways of getting the money to the defence sector need to be thought about, not least the idea of a European rearmament bank or something along those sorts of lines.
You are mentioning money. How much it will cost for Europe to rearm itself?
It's an impossible question to answer, I'm afraid, because it comes down to not a percentage of GDP.
800 billion are enough? Sorry, 800 billion are enough? Because that's the amount of money that Ursula announced.
I have no idea. We're having a huge amount of trouble hearing you at the moment. Can you get on to your technical people? There's some background conversation going on, as if we've got 2 parallel conferences going at the moment. I will attempt to answer the question, but please, in the background, could you get your technical people to grip this? Because at the moment, it's almost impossible. I don't know how much money needs to be spent. A lot depends upon what the strategy is going to be for NATO, on the assumption that we have less European support. Less American support. And that is a strategy that's going to determine what our posture looks like, how we burden share, how we get over interoperability, how we seek to replace the capabilities that the Americans might remove from a European-led NATO. Who knows? And until you've identified those sorts of questions, it's very difficult to work out what the means should be alongside the ways to achieve the obvious end. And I've no idea what that costs, but you can bet your bottom dollar it costs rather more than spending at the moment.
Your Excellency, you would like to add something?
Yes, I would like to react to this part of the debate with the point of caution. What I'm missing here is really a sense of urgency. What we heard yesterday and today, basically the narrative, the mainstream, we are not yet ready. We will need 5 to 7 years. The white paper timeline refers to 5-7 years for the EU to rearm, meaning to be ready to face possible, probable aggression of the Russian test in NATO, Article 5. And then yesterday, one of the participants, I believe that was Dutch participant, who said that, and if Ukraine collapses, then it will be a real problem for us. And then, speaking to, I see German colleagues here, yesterday the deputy chief of the intelligence, and before that, a month ago, his boss said, we expect that we'll be ready by 2030, but if the war ends sooner, then we will have a problem. So how it's received in Ukraine, it's basically that we need to have more time for you to fighting with the Russians on the Ukrainian soil before we will be ready. And I want to caution against this. You don't have a luxury for the next 5 years. I think the sense of urgency, what is needed. Therefore, the trajectory that is, okay, they're fighting now, they prove that they're fighters, the battle-hardened army, the strongest in Europe now, they can produce also weapons at the time of war. Defense sector is working. So the demand for the drones, 2 million per year for the Ukraine armed forces. So I want to caution against this kind of laying behind and waiting for the war somehow to continue, but not coming as closer to us as it could be dangerous. No, you don't have this time. We don't have this time. Therefore, I think the sense of urgency should be here and translated into the politics. And I believe it's very important now for our German colleagues with the new government coming to place to learn the lessons also to the first attempt of the reunified or unified Germany when the Chancellor Merkel tried to lead conflict mediation, conflict resolution effort when the Russians occupied Donbass and annexed Crimea. Minsk I and Minsk II failed. So there should be lessons learned. I believe now there is a growing political will to learn these lessons in Germany, and I believe Germany has a good capacity also to deliver of the what has been a long time expected. The Taurus is one of those, a more robust cooperation with the Ukrainian defense industry to allow us to produce what is needed by our means. So this is the message I would like to send to our dear audience here and to relative capitals also, because they are symmetric war. Yes, it is not anymore the First World War style war with artillery be the god of the war. Now the drones are becoming the goddess of the war, but it may change very quickly.
Moving to the end, I would like to pose the same question to the three speakers. Your Excellency, how does the war end?
You know, war, this is not an event.
Cool.
War is about people. And how the war ends or will end will depend on the people, their actions or lack of actions. The people, including those who are sitting in this room and the governments that are in other capitals, people will define the end of the war and how it will end. But I would like to remind, as a historian, When we are saying that this war is not about the territory, but about who will write the rules of the new security order, it's the privilege of the winners, not the losers. So if you want to be on the winning side and being together with others, probably that would include Chinese and Indians and others, realignment, the topic of this 10th Delphi conference, realignment, the new security order, when it comes, so everybody wants to be on the winning side. So this is answering your question, how this would depend on the people, their actions, their political will. Ukrainians will not give up. Ukrainians will not surrender. This is also something that's very important for you to understand in terms of planning your line of actions.
General Carter, I would like to pose the same exactly question. How does the war end for you?
Well, in my experience, I'm afraid all wars end in a conversation. But the conversation only starts when both parties believe they're in a position to have that conversation and probably compromise. And we've heard from the first deputy chairman what he believes the red lines are from a Ukrainian perspective. And we also know what Putin's red lines are at the moment. And you'll recall the essay he read in 2021 on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. For him, this is an issue of Ukraine's sovereignty. So we're not going to be in a position, I would have thought, for some time to come before either party is going to be in a position to have a proper conversation. And that, of course, is why Putin is now being accused of dragging his feet by the American negotiating team, because they realize this is not a real estate deal. It's actually rather more profound from a Russian perspective. Now, I don't have an answer to any of those questions, but suffice it to say that wars end in a conversation, and that's where this has to go. I also very much agree with the First Deputy Chairman's observation about a sense of urgency. It is unacceptable that Europe finds itself in a position that it can't fix the problem of what the US may do within NATO for anything like 5 years. I mean, that's unacceptable. Many of us who've been involved in this war since 2014 and have personally been to Ukraine many times to help with the training even before the invasion in 2022, firmly knew that this was going to happen. The question was, what are we going to do about it? And I'm afraid successive leaders have ignored the problem. They never believed it would happen. And the upshot of all of that is that our bluff has been called. And there's a serious risk that our bluff will be called again. Because Article 5 of the NATO treaty is no longer what it once was. And I would not be surprised if Mr. Putin doesn't try and take a little bite out of a Baltic country at some stage in the next 3 years, given that he will be wondering whether our bluff is there to be called again.
Professor, we are concluding with your comment and thoughts. How does the war end?
Thank you. Perhaps they can now turn off this other panel that is in the background constantly running, but I will try and speak against it. I agree with the General that actually wars end in conversations, but of course we can't even get at the moment to a conversation. And I think the truth is also, based on Putin's historical essay, that for Putin and his maximalist points, he wants basically the wiping of Ukraine off the map. And at minimum, at the moment, he's certainly pushing for this idea of this Novaya Russia, which actually means Russia going all the way, at least Odessa, to get the entire southern coast of Ukraine. And I know from the Finnish experience that, territorial losses are absolutely dreadful. And also this idea of telling Ukraine some option of neutrality, some option of Finlandization is frankly intolerable as well. I think that's where, we are really struggling with this American position, because I think the West has to really highlight that, Russia cannot be allowed to do this ever again, were you ever to get to a ceasefire and peace conversation. But I think beyond the territorial question, and that's where I agree with our Ukrainian colleague, is that this is not just about the territory. This is also about a political war, which, among others, and I include China there, but Russia is conducting what it calls non-linear and hybrid warfare, and that is an ideological political war against our societies, against our political systems. It is not just questions about the inviolability of borders. It is also a question about, for example, the principle of equal sovereignty and the freedom of choice of sciences. And so I think all those principles is something we need to uphold. And our problem is that we need to take tactical decisions in the short run, as to how to manage the situation and give Ukraine all the help that it needs to fight this war, because obviously Ukrainians will be fighting this war to secure their independence. Yes, there may be discussions about certain territories at some point, but how do you secure the survivability of that state? And if we are not supportive of that, then every country's position that is next to a predator like Russia is on the line, because under that idea that there isn't equal sovereignty, but that there is sovereignty of the big powers, makes life together very much impossible, not least on the European continent.
I see. Professor, Professor, thank you so much. General Cerny Carter, thank you for joining this online panel. Your Excellency, thank you for being here. It was our great honor. Thank you so much for your attention.